Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. And today we're operating with the fourth episode dealing with our great lumbering era, which was the driving engine for Pensacola beginning about 1870 and continuing for half a century. This is when the great early fortunes were made, when the waterfront prospect was formed, and when all of the major elements which made up our city came into being. We talked in the last few episodes about how the first mill operators arrived here, the methods that they used, how oxen and water flumes and streams and logging railroads all came into being and had their place in here. And we would mention just in passing here that one of the major elements that people somehow forget was that our Escambia River was it was an artery for the lumbering era. And basically it worked like this. A number of the mills that we're talking about were located well north of us, a number of them in the Bruton, Alabama area. And basically how this would handle was this way. They didn't use the railroads for their timber. Basically what would happen was that the logs that had been cut would be gathered at a point at the upper level of the river. It was called the Conecuh up at that point. They would be formed into rafts. And then the rafts would have 2 or 3 very skilled men on them, and those men would then, they would flow down the river, and the men would have long poles so they could guide the raft if they came too close to the shore or to a snag of some kind. The raft would move down, and it would arrive at what we today call the Ferry Pass. Now, Ferry Pass was a business. It was operated by the Ferry Pass Lumbermen's Association. And basically the idea was this. Every mill had its own brand, and every log was branded, just like cattle were branded in the Old West. And as the logs came down, the numbers were recorded, their size was recorded, so that every member of the association would have a safety valve there on its own production, and also they would pay a small tax to make sure that all of the infrastructure of the industry was taken care of. And the Ferry Pass operation ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and handled thousands and thousands of logs every day, and of course, or every year rather. And as they came down, of course, the logs would move down to the mouth of the river, and there they would usually be picked up by a tugboat, and the tug would pull them either to the mill that they were going to be serviced at, or down to the harbor itself, where they would be brought to the dock, and that of course would be where they would be loaded. Now, some of the vessels that came here to pick up timber were especially fitted. They were very unique because they had huge ports cut in the sides of the vessel, so that if you brought these 16-foot huge logs to the side of the vessel, you didn't have to haul it up on top of the deck. They simply maneuvered it into the lower cargo hold of the ship itself, and that's what made it possible for this kind of a movement to the east. Now, another part that we need to spend just a second on here, because it was part of the whole story in lumbering, and it came out. It changed in the latter part of the 1880s. In an earlier episode, I mentioned that every vessel coming from New England or from Scandinavia usually came here loaded in rock ballast. And at first, they simply threw it over the side, and that wasn't working very well. So they made arrangements for special carters to take the log in the rock in wagons, and they just literally dumped it over in what we today call East Hill, hoping that somebody could find some use of it later. Well, that wasn't working. It was too slow. So in the 1880s, the city council gave a franchise to the E.E. Saunders Company. We'll be talking about them in another episode on fishing. And they had the franchise to literally unload the rock, put it in the water in a systematic way right at the edge of the bay, and then they would cover it over with clay and sand, and literally step by step, block by block, they were making new land. And over time, in the course of our story, about 16 square blocks of our downtown area, that land which is south of Main Street, was literally created this way through the workings of the Saunders people. So it was that itself was a very sizable part of the story. Well, going back again to the manufacture of lumbering, we don't want to forget a few of the things that these people did. We think in terms, for example, that they just cut the logs into size and made planks out of them, and away they went. But that wasn't quite the way it was, because as these companies operated, they had opportunities to do something else. As the housing market developed here, the people who were building these nice houses wanted to be able to use trim that matched what they saw being built in fashionable homes in Boston and Newport and places like that. And this meant balusters, balustrades, extra trim on the outside, just all sorts of beautiful things, nice windows. And so there were specialty mills that opened up that did just exactly that. They took lumber and matched it into this different kind of production. Then there was what we would today call scrap. And the scrap was used for different things. They made it into, first of all, into barrel staves to make barrels, which would be used largely in the naval stores industry, which we will talk about, I hope, in another session a little bit later on. And then as we get into the latter part of the 1880s, they began to cut some of this scrap into wooden blocks, about 6 inches square, and they would import creosote oil from England, saturate those blocks with the creosote, and those blocks then became the first paving material that we had for our downtown streets. These paving blocks and brick were the first hard surfacing that any of the streets in Pensacola had. So we had one mill doing this, another mill doing that, but most of the bigger mills, and T.R. Miller in Bruton, for example, was one of the best examples of this, as was Simpson. They made a huge number of these materials. The number of staves and so forth that were being shipped for export for companies in Europe was absolutely huge. In fact, I think we still have one of the figures here. Yes, in 1900, this says that the shipment included 944,000 barrel staves that were shipped out of here, and I have no idea how many barrels they made out of that, but nonetheless, you get an idea of how big that part of the business actually was. Well, now, as all of this is coming together, people are having a wonderful time. The men who are coming into here are largely they're transients in some sense. These are the men, the lumberjacks and people of that kind. They lived in the woods, usually 6 days a week. Some of them the ones that worked in the mills. Of course, these weren't weren't lumberjacks exactly, but the people who lived and worked in the mills themselves, such as the one at Bay Point, lived in a village. Now, the Simpson Company, the Perodis, and others literally built a village around their mill. That's where the people lived. There was a company store, there was a post office, a school, a church. This was a unified community, and basically people that lived there had little reason to come to Pensacola or any place else, and largely we could also say it was very difficult because there wasn't any way you could simply get here in a hurry. So the whole community was together and a kind of a unified affair, and that's what we also had in places such as Millview and Muskogee. And of course, another part of it, another town that organized about the same way, came into being in the year 1900, was the community at Century. Century was the result of a new mill created by General Alger and Martin Sullivan, who Sullivan had access to about 200,000 acres in that area, and Sullivan was an experienced lumberman. They put the whole thing together, and to put this mill on stream, they literally created the village of Century. Or I call it village. That's not fair. They called it the city of Century, and that is technically what it is as of today. But all of these, you see, all these people were living like that. The lumberjacks, on the other hand, many of them would be living right close to the site of where they were doing the cutting, and the technique then was quite different. Basically, what they would have would be camps that they could set up there and move. And as the logging railroads came into greater prominence, what the lumber companies would do would buy old, worn-out boxcars, put them on a sidetrack at the cutting site, put hammocks in them, and then have mess cars along with the same segment of cars. And that's where these men lived, worked, ate, and if they got into town on weekends, that was fine. And of course, when they came to town, that was a whole new industry that developed along with the logging period. This is when we began to have billiard halls and saloons by the score, and houses of prostitution were put in place there. All of this became part of a new era, and the city council in Pensacola had its troubles at this time because they had to police all of that and do it in a way that was not going to antagonize the entrepreneurs. And also, of course, up until the 1880s, and we'll be talking about this in another episode, up until that point in time, the city of Pensacola was a pretty disorganized group, and their police force was It was hardly what you would call up to date, and there were so many jobs available in other areas that paid more that they had a point where the turnover in police force was as much as 25% a month. So it's very difficult to keep the peace, but nonetheless, somehow they did it. Now, I wanted to come back to a story we started on in our last episode, the story of the Bars family, because they are typical. Well, no, that's not right. We shouldn't say typical. They were a driving force in a different sense. Henry Bars made a lot of money. He had contacts with 65 different areas. He brought his brother-in-law, Brian Dunwoody, into the area, and also had him in the business. They did extremely well, and he had two sons, John and Ernest, John, Ernest, and Theo. These sons were together. They worked hard, and the Bars family had two stories that are worth repeating because they tie into the future of Pensacola. In the first one, Henry Bars was a very generous man, and he and his wife had a custom. When every gift-giving occasion that came along, birthday, Christmas, anniversary, he would come to her and say, "What would you like this time?" And Mrs. Bars would always say, "Buy me a piece of land." And of course, as this took place, the lumbering era had cut land way farther and farther away from the city of Pensacola. And he would go out and he'd buy her 100 acres here, 200 acres there. Well, by the time Henry Bars died, in 1909, Mrs. Bars had accumulated about 6,500 acres of land. Now, we might say offhand, well, that doesn't mean too much until we stop and say, well, what's on that land today? Well, we the Pensacola Municipal Airport, Cordova Mall, East Pensacola Heights, Pensacola Junior College, and on and on and on. That's where the land went. And obviously, the family, when they went into the real estate business, did very well on it. The second of their stories comes forward, and we'll be touching this again in another way later. And this was the story of the end of the war, of the Spanish-American War. At the end, the Bars family was sitting there. The three of the men were sitting in the Bars little office down on the waterfront one morning, reading the paper, and they came across a story. And Henry Bars said, "Look what the government is doing now." And they all gathered around and said, they're going to give, the federal government is going to give every man who served in the war warrants exchangeable for land on Perdido Key, Florida. Well, the three looked at one and said, "No, why would a man in Maine or New York want that? Perdido Key is very nice, but there isn't a tree, there isn't a house, there isn't a road, there isn't a dock. Why would they want that?" And Henry Bars said, "Exactly. Now, we might be able to do something with that." So they quickly got a roster of all the men who had served, and they hired 3 men, gave them checkbooks, and these men began to go and contact the servicemen, offering what we would call pennies on the dollar for their warrants. And they collected a great number of these warrants, and ultimately, when the exchange time came, the Bars family exchanged the warrants they had gained for 13,000 acres of land on Perdido Key. Now, the family literally sat on that property out there for almost 75 years. It was used. They paid taxes. In fact, they almost lost it for taxes during World War II. But then something rather unusual happened. I don't know. I didn't ever see it happen myself, but there must have been a flock of great birds that came across and began to drop seeds across Perdido Key, and out of the ground came hotels and condominiums and fine homes and so forth. And obviously the Bars family and that investment of 2 generations back paid off. Well, we'll have one more episode to talk about lumbering here. I want to bring the story to a close in that episode to tell you how it all finally came down and how foresight was absent throughout much of this period, and as a result of that, we had to literally start over again in our economy in Northwest Florida. Lumbering had been wonderful for almost 50 years, but then something bad happened, and we'll talk about that next time.